In 450, Marcian ascended to the Byzantine throne and he would rule until his death in 457. Now, Marcian gets a very positive press in our sources, but in this video I'd like to suggest that a lot of that press was more or less undeserved and had to do with the fact that he was a patron of the elite and that the elite went on to write all the histories about Marcian's reign. Let's take a look back at the circumstances which led to the rise of Marcian to the imperial throne. So in 450, Theodosius II was on his deathbed, and he had never had a male heir. His one daughter had been married off to his cousin Valentinian III. So that was one option. He could leave the empire to Valentinian III, the emperor of the West, and then that would reunite the East and West and leave the entire empire in the hands of members of the Theodosian Dynasty. He also had another option. Of his three sisters, one of them was still alive, but Pulcheria, the remaining sister, was actually older than Theodosius. She was in her early 50s, and she had taken a vow of virginity as a teenager, and therefore had never had any children herself. So what was Theodosius to do? Well, it looks like Pulcheria decided to make the choice for him. So during the last several years of Theodosius' reign, he and his sister Pulcheria had been at odds due to a falling out between Pulcheria and Theodosius' wife, the Empress Eudokia. However, while Theodosius was on his deathbed, he and Pulcheria were able to reconcile with one another. And as a part of that process, or so it would seem, Theodosius became willing to allow Pulcheria to realize her ambitions. Now, early in his own reign, Pulcheria had been one of the chief powers behind the throne, and then she had lost a lot of her influence to Eudokia. However, now with Eudokia in perpetual self-exile in Jerusalem, and Theodosius dying, Pulcheria was able to step forward, and Theodosius was going to leave the scene soon, so he decided that this might be a decent parting gift to his wife. And I'm sort of guessing at what happened when I'm talking about like how Theodosius came to terms with Pulcheria getting to make this choice. The actual circumstances are a little murky. Anyway, so again, Pulcheria had taken a vow to remain a virgin as a teenager, and she had no intention of ever breaking that. But what she and her brother worked out is that she could set up a special marriage where, while it would be a legal marriage, she would not be required to have sex with her new husband, and that husband could then hold the imperial throne. So, kind of an odd arrangement to work around the excessive religiosity of Pulcheria, but again, you know, people do weird things for family, I guess. And she decided to pick a senator who was in good stead with Aspar, who was the senior military official in the East at this time, and one of the major power brokers. We'll talk a lot more about Aspar in my next video on Leo I, by the way. And the man that Pulcheria picked to be her platonic husband was someone named Marcian. Marcian had a long and interesting life behind him when he ascended to the throne in 450. In 392, he was born in either Thrace or Illyricum. Both of these areas are famous for producing a large number of the soldiers in the Byzantine army during this period. He followed in that tradition by becoming a soldier, and he rose through the ranks rather quickly, which sort of implies he was probably of a relatively high social background. And he was the tribune of his unit by the 420s. We're not sure exactly what date, but somewhere in that time period. One detail that we know about him, which ended up working in his favor, is that while he was on the way to fight a war on the Persian front, he fell ill and had to be left behind. And he ended up at Constantinople, and there he served as domesticus under Artiberius and Aspar. That's sort of a lower military official, so he was able to get the attention of Artiberius, who was the guy who commanded the big expedition in Italy under the direction of Theodosius II, which installed Valentinian III, and then Aspar, who was the real hero of that campaign and the son of Artiberius. So having that connection to both of these guys really made Marcian's career. Later, he was sent in a failed expedition to Africa in 431, and supposedly there is a tale that he was captured and brought before King Gaiseric of the Vandals, and that he swore that he would never again make war upon the Vandals or disturb the peace of Africa. And people use this story to explain why Marcian never sent a retaliatory strike to Africa after the sack of Rome in 455. And again, because this guy is super well connected, he was able to serve as the captain of the palace guards at one point in the 430s or maybe the 440s, maybe some time period bridging those 2 decades. What we do know is that by 450 he had left military service and he was a senator at Constantinople who was 58 years old. Immediately upon assuming the throne, Marcian made his opening move, which was to execute the eunuch Chrysaphus, who had been Theodosius' advisor for the last several years of his reign. And the reason I say that this was almost certainly done at Pulcheria's insistence is because the two of them had been bitter rivals for influence with Theodosius II, and you can see here that that would make a lot of sense that Pulcheria would want to take him out, since she was trying to move on and be the primary advisor to the throne for her new husband. Marcian almost immediately ended Byzantium's annual gold subsidies to Attila the Hun. Those had been instituted by Theodosius II, and that was seen as the best and most cost-effective way to prevent Attila from ravaging the Eastern Empire. Theodosius II actually had some fairly good reasons for having those subsidies. He had had some close calls during his reign, but Marcian decided to end those immediately. And some of his contemporary historians, the guys who were really favorable to Marcian, probably worked with him in the Senate at one point, praised him for his boldness. But at this time, Attila was gearing up for a major campaign against the West, and when you're storing up that kind of grain and you're amassing that many men, word gets out and spreads over long distances. So it's pretty likely that Marcian already knew that Attila had his sights set elsewhere and wouldn't be able to retaliate for a while. So it's possible that Marcian's plan was to use the money he would save from not paying that subsidy to build an army and maybe challenge Attila later. So this wasn't a completely mindless move or some move that was, really inspired or super bold. It was just one that was made knowing that Attila couldn't do anything about it in the near future. So I think that is a distinction that needs to be made. So how did Marcian become so popular with all of the contemporary historians from the 5th century? Well, pretty simple. He cut their taxes fairly dramatically. So at the time when he came to power, there was a tax called the Fullis. I believe it dates back to Constantine I, which was a tax of 7 pounds of gold on the property of senators. Well, Marcian ends that. So that's 7 pounds of gold each senator gets to keep every single year. He also granted a remission of tax arrears early on, and tax arrears are taxes that you owe from previous years. So that helped quite a few people, not just the super rich, but also a lot of towns and provincial farmers and that kind of stuff. So, that's a pretty easy way to buy popularity early on in your reign. And maybe he was able to afford these by cutting that subsidy to Attila that first year. I don't know. Another thing that he did which made him popular with the senatorial class is that rather than a senator having to marry from a narrow circle of women of senatorial rank, now they're allowed to marry any respectable free woman, meaning any free woman in a trade which is considered respectable. Basically, as long as she's not an actress or prostitute, she's respectable. And that is ultimately a law which will be utilized by Justinian I when he marries Theodora, and also by Justinian's general Belisarius when he marries his wife Antonina. Neither one of those women were from a particularly high social rank. Marcian's domestic policy largely centered upon making the infrastructure of Constantinople better. So he spent a lot of time and money focusing on repairing aqueducts and making other improvements while ending payments to the populace. So a lot of the subsidized or free food and occasional money handouts to the populace were ended. And that's something that would have really endeared him to the senators, who were always bemoaning the mob. The problem is, senators tended to get lots of free things from the state, but they never saw those as a problem. However, if a poor person gets something from the state, then it's apparently a crying shame. I don't know. Not, obviously we have a little bit of that hypocrisy still going on today. Anyway, because Marcian was mostly about saving money, In addition to his relatively conservative ideas of what to spend on for infrastructure, he was able to leave the treasury with reserves, and that would be pretty useful for Leo and Zeno and his successors. Now, his reign would be relatively peaceful, and some people would actually view it as a golden age. And keep in mind, though, the people who viewed his reign as a golden age were rich men of the senatorial class who gained a lot of wealth because of Marcian being on the throne. Although the details are a bit scanty, it's pretty likely that Marcian was guided through most of his domestic policy, or at least a great deal of it, by his primary advisor, Euphemius, the Master of Offices, who remained with Marcian for the entirety of his 7-year reign. Due to the mostly peaceful nature of Marcian's reign, the best well-known event from that time was actually the Fourth Ecumenical Council in 451. At that council, Marcian and Pulcheria presided in person, which suggests that Pulcheria had a very active hand in government during the first 3 years of Marcian's reign. This council dealt with the issue of Nestorianism once again. We've talked about that before. Look at my Theodosius II video for details. And on the teachings of Eutyches, who was an older gentleman who I believe was coming up with his own sort of spin on Nestorianism. I might be wrong about that. I don't really care. Theology is not my cup of tea. Anyway, this council at first was seen as a success, and it would be upheld for a while. But it would have long-term consequences that could not have possibly been foreseen in 451, and we'll get into those in due time once we get to the Emperor Zeno and the Emperor Anastasius. Under Marcian, the Byzantines didn't engage in any major wars. However, they did fight a couple of minor ones. One of them was in Syria against the Arabs. Not many details are known. Presumably it was an Arab raid that the local governor had to deal with. A more interesting and well-known confrontation occurred in the Upper Nile, where the general named Florus was able to defeat attacks from beyond the frontier and gain some fame. He would never go on to become emperor or really be mentioned again, though, so I guess his fame was a bit fleeting. So if you recall, Marcian provoked Attila early in his reign by cutting off the annual gold subsidy, and Attila didn't do anything for a couple years. So the first few years of Marcian's reign, Attila was occupied fighting the West, and he was not able to overcome the Western Empire, despite the fact that he inflicted quite a bit of damage. In 453, Attila was regrouping, and he was preparing to attack the East once again, possibly because the East has more money, and it would be a much more lucrative campaign. And at some point, he was, over that winter from, I believe it was 452 to 453, he was celebrating a wedding. He was getting married for probably like the 8th time. I'll just throw that number out there. I don't know how many actual weddings he had celebrated. And he presumably had a little too much to drink, and he had a brain aneurysm and died. He was in his 40s or 50s. Anyway, because the circumstances of his death are a little weird, there have been some modern historians who have speculated that Marcian was the ultimate cause of Attila's death and that he had Attila poisoned. However, a lot of people who think that are really overestimating the effectiveness of ancient spies, and they may have seen one too many James Bond movies for their own good. Marcian seems to have achieved basically everything that he accomplished as emperor within his first couple of years, and then the last several years of his reign seem to be a bit more depressing and subdued. So in 453, his platonic wife Pulcheria died at the age of 54 or 55. She died suddenly and for no discernible reason, just like most Theodosian dynasty people did. However, she did make it past the age of 50, so I guess that's kind of impressive, since almost every other Theodosian that I'm aware of didn't really make it. Her death stunned Constantinople, and she was missed by the entire populace. She had been someone who practiced charity and that kind of stuff, so they liked her quite a bit, especially when her husband was not really a big spender. And in her will, she donated all of her belongings to the poor, so I'm sure that really increased her standing among the city populace that much more. And because of her deeds and because the Eastern and Western churches were still united at the time, she is a saint in both the Orthodox and Catholic churches today. The year 455 was a rough year for the Western Roman Empire. Valentinian III executed his general Flavius Aetius, the guy who had defeated Attila the Hun in Gaul, and in turn he was murdered by Aetius's partisans in March of 455. This created a leadership void in the west, and it officially ended the Theodosian line in the west. Between June 2nd and June 16th, the Vandals under an elderly King Gaiseric went to Rome and negotiated a bloodless sack of the city, which far exceeded Alaric's sack in 410 in terms of the number of things that were stolen. During this period, even after the extended sack of Rome, Marcian did nothing. He did not intervene in this affair, and he did not retaliate against the Vandals in any way. On January 27, 457, Marcian died at the age of 65 after returning from a religious pilgrimage. He was then buried at the Church of the Holy Apostles next to his Platonic wife, Pulcheria. And Marcian had been considered a member of the Theodosian Dynasty by virtue of marriage, so his death in early 457 marks the official end of the Theodosian Dynasty. He did leave behind one daughter named Marcia Euphemia, and she would later marry the Western Emperor Anthemius. Now, I've already stated my opinion of Marcian. I think that he was highly overrated, and that his reputation stems almost entirely from the fact that he appeased the rich, and the rich went on to write the histories. I would also point out that he got pretty damn lucky when it came to his policy towards Attila, since Attila had an aneurysm and died before he could make Marcian pay for breaking the agreement that his predecessor had made. So anyway, find out what happens next time when the choice of the next emperor falls upon the most prestigious man in the Eastern Empire, Aspar.